Leyte Island, Philippines, October 24, 1944, the jungle trembled. From the dense green walls of palm and bamboo came the echo of grinding tracks. Deep, metallic, hungry. Japanese infantry froze, rifles clutched tight, eyes darting toward the tree line. They had fought tanks before. Slow, predictable machines they could outflank or burn. But this sound was different. It was faster, sharper. Then, through the drifting smoke, they saw it. A low, angular silhouette gliding across the mud. Its turret turned with uncanny speed. A flash, then thunder. A single American shell ripped through a Type 97 Chiha before its crew even knew where to aim. The air filled with fire and panic. Within seconds, Japanese armor that had once dominated Asian battlefields lay silent and burning. The men who survived would later whisper about those machines. The American tank destroyers that moved like ghosts and struck like lightning. Because that day, in the jungles of Leyte, Japan learned that courage alone could not stop evolution. When war ignited across the Pacific, tanks were never meant to define Japan's battlefield strategy. The Imperial Japanese Army built its armored forces around a single purpose: to support infantry, not to dominate enemy armor. Their tanks, like the Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha, were light, mobile, and effective against the ill-equipped colonial forces of the 1930s. In China and early campaigns in Southeast Asia, that approach worked. The jungle was thin, resistance light, and the myth of Japanese invincibility spread with each victory. But by 1942, that illusion began to fracture. Across the Pacific, the United States had awakened and was studying every mistake made in Europe. The Americans had seen firsthand how the German blitzkrieg used speed, communication, and combined arms to tear through the French lines. They learned, painfully, that a tank alone was not enough. What mattered was doctrine, mobility, and the coordination of firepower. Back in Washington, a visionary general named Leslie J. McNair began reshaping the U.S. Army's entire approach to armored warfare. McNair believed that tanks should not waste themselves in duels against other tanks. That was the job of a new breed of weapon: the tank destroyer. The concept was radical: create a specialized, fast, lightly armored vehicle built purely to hunt enemy armor, using speed and agility as protection instead of heavy plating. In his words, "We must outthink the enemy, not out-armor him." By 1942, the first tank destroyer command was born. Training centers across the United States echoed with new doctrine: seek, strike, and destroy. The idea was to let tanks spearhead offensives, while mobile anti-tank units lurked like predators, waiting for enemy armor to reveal itself. The first practical results were the M10 Wolverine and M18 Hellcat, followed later by the M36 Jackson. Each represented a shift in American design philosophy. The M10 carried a 3-inch gun on a Sherman chassis. Crude, but effective. The M18, however, was something else entirely. Fast, sleek, able to hit 55 miles per hour. The fastest armored vehicle of the entire war. Its open turret meant danger for the crew, but unmatched visibility for the gunner. To the untrained eye, they seemed reckless designs. To trained men, they were masterpieces of purpose. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japanese strategists still saw tanks as infantry tools to breach defenses and chase down retreating soldiers. They underestimated the role of armor versus armor. The result was a fleet of outdated, lightly armored machines, most of which could be pierced even by an American .50 caliber round. As the U.S. began reclaiming territory in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas, Japanese tank units suffered repeated humiliation. Crews reported shells bouncing harmlessly off American armor, while their own machines burned within seconds. The imbalance was growing clearer with every island taken. And yet, the Japanese High Command refused to admit that their armor philosophy had failed. Instead, they doubled down on spirit, the notion that courage and willpower could overcome steel and speed. But machines do not feel fear. And by late 1943, the factories of Detroit were producing hundreds of tank destroyers a month, while Japan's industry, crippled by shortages, was barely keeping its older tanks running. In every sense, industrial, tactical, psychological, a storm was forming. By mid-1944, as American forces closed in on the Philippines, the U.S. Army's tank destroyer battalions were battle-tested from Italy to Normandy. They had faced Panthers and Tigers, the deadliest tanks on Earth, and survived. When they arrived in the Pacific, they carried not only their weapons, but their experience, an understanding of movement, coordination, and speed that Japan's forces had never encountered. The Japanese command believed the Philippines could be held. They saw their tanks as instruments of national pride, ready to repel the invader. But what was about to descend upon them was unlike anything they had seen. Machines built to hunt, not to defend. In a few months' time, those jungles would burn with the echo of their own disbelief. When American tank destroyer units began deploying to the Pacific in 1944, they entered a world completely unlike Europe. There were no wide fields, no sweeping maneuvers, only claustrophobic jungles, humid valleys, and narrow trails carved through mud and stone. Here, visibility was measured in meters, not miles. The doctrine that had triumphed in France had to be reborn. Tank destroyers, built for open country hunting, were now forced to adapt to an environment that swallowed engines, jammed guns, and hid enemies behind every tree. Yet adaptation was what defined American warfare. Engineers stripped unnecessary armor, lightened tracks, and reinforced air filters to withstand tropical moisture. Crews mounted makeshift canopies against monsoon rains. The open-topped turrets, once a liability, now became an advantage, allowing commanders and gunners to see movement in the thick foliage before it was too late. At first, even U.S. commanders doubted whether such machines could operate in these conditions. But on the island of New Guinea, and later at Biak, Bougainville, and Guam, the results spoke for themselves. Tank destroyers proved they could move where standard tanks could not, climbing ridges, crossing riverbanks, and ambushing bunkers with surgical precision. Each engagement rewrote the rules. While Japanese forces relied heavily on entrenched positions and ambush tactics, the tank destroyers transformed into mobile artillery platforms. Their 70 physics emitters and 90mm guns blasted pillboxes, caves, and wooden fortifications that had resisted everything short of naval bombardment. This new versatility made them invaluable. The Pacific battlefield had never seen such a weapon. Half tank, half artillery piece, operated by crews who understood movement as an art form. But for the Japanese, this new reality was terrifying. Their own tanks, the pride of earlier campaigns, were becoming relics. The Type 95 Hago, once feared in China, was barely protected by 12mm of armor, thinner than an American soldier's helmet. Even the improved Type 97 Chi-Ha, with its 57mm gun, was powerless against the long-barreled 76mm cannon of the M18 Hellcat. When their shells struck the American destroyers, they ricocheted harmlessly off the sloped armor or missed entirely. The U.S. machines were simply too fast to target. In return, the destroyers' high-velocity rounds punched through Japanese armor as if it were paper. Reports from surviving Japanese tankers read like laments. They described watching comrades vanish in explosions so sudden that no one had time to bail out. They called the American vehicles Kaminari no Kuruma, cars of thunder. Yet the Japanese response was not technological. It was spiritual. Unable to match industrial power, they turned to desperation. Infantry units were trained to crawl beneath U.S. vehicles with magnetic mines or grenades. Men tied explosives to their bodies and flung themselves against armor. The beginning of what Americans called suicide charges. But courage cannot overcome physics. The Americans adjusted again, keeping tank destroyers in close coordination with infantry, using flamethrowers and heavy machine guns to protect their flanks. Every island became a laboratory for adaptation. Every battle refined the art of mechanized war in the jungle. By late 1944, U.S. armored columns were rolling deeper into the Philippines. General MacArthur's forces, landing on Leyte, brought with them the full arsenal of modern warfare, including tank destroyer battalions equipped with the M10 and M18. For Japan, this was supposed to be the decisive stand. They believed the terrain, weather, and spirit of their soldiers would neutralize America's mechanical advantage. They were certain that the American tanks would bog down, their engines fail, their guns turn useless in the humidity. They were wrong. When the destroyers came, they came in silence. Low silhouettes gliding through the jungle, engines muffled, barrels already aimed. The first engagement would leave Japanese commanders speechless. The second would shatter the myth of armored parity forever. The Pacific War was no longer a contest of courage. It was a test of evolution, one that Japan was losing with every shell that left an American barrel. And by the time the flames rose over Leyte, the Imperial Army would finally understand just how far the world had moved ahead of them. They were young, most of them no older than 22, farm boys from Iowa, machinists from Detroit, mechanics from New Jersey, men who had grown up building cars and now found themselves inside one of war's most dangerous vehicles. A tank destroyer was never a fortress. Its armor was thin enough to be pierced by machine gun fire. Its open turret left the crew exposed to shrapnel, rain, and heat. Inside, it smelled of sweat, grease, and cordite, the sharp scent of fired shells lingering in the steel walls. Yet these men learned to move as one. The driver had to feel the ground, the gunner had to sense distance by instinct, and the commander had to decide, in seconds, whether to fight or vanish. They called it shoot and scoot. Never stay long enough for the enemy to aim back. Fire, reverse, relocate, fire again. To the crews, survival was not luck. It was choreography. They knew that a single mistake, a second's hesitation, could turn their vehicle into a burning coffin. Letters home spoke less about heroism and more about exhaustion. In the humid jungles, they slept beside their machines, boots caked in mud, hands blistered from recoil shock. They joked that their destroyers were death traps on wheels, but they also knew that their speed was life itself. What kept them going was trust, in their machines, in their training, and in each other. Every shell they fired carried the weight of that trust. By 1944, American tank destroyer battalions had refined a method of war that was both elegant and brutal. Their doctrine was built around a single, unbreakable rule: mobility equals survival. While standard tanks like the Sherman advanced steadily with infantry, tank destroyers were the hunters, moving fast, striking first, and vanishing before the enemy could react. In Europe, this doctrine had evolved to counter German Panthers and Tigers. In the Pacific, it became something else entirely. Here, the destroyers fought not against massive armored divisions, but against cunning ambushes, mines, and suicide teams. Tactical precision replaced open-field maneuver. American units used combined arms coordination. Infantry scouts identified enemy armor, artillery pinned positions, and tank destroyers moved in like assassins, finishing what the others started. Each engagement demanded calm under pressure. In narrow jungle passes, they reversed more than they advanced. Gunners fired blind into the smoke, trusting radio calls and instinct. If the Japanese closed in, the destroyers' .50 caliber machine guns swept the undergrowth in bursts that tore entire squads apart. They became mobile fortresses in an environment that devoured static defenses. Their role blurred: anti-tank, anti-fortification, direct fire support. What began as a theoretical doctrine became an art of improvisation. It wasn't the armor that won battles. It was movement. In the Pacific, mobility was not just an advantage. It was dominance, the true shock for Japanese. Troops wasn't just the presence of American tank destroyers. It was how advanced they were. The M18 Hellcat was the fastest armored fighting vehicle of the Second World War. Powered by a 400 horsepower radial engine, it could accelerate from 0 to 30 miles per hour in under 10 seconds. Unheard of for a 20-ton machine. Its torsion bar suspension and lightweight frame allowed it to glide across terrain that bogged down heavier tanks. Then came the M36 Jackson, fitted with a 90mm gun, the same weapon that later pierced German King Tigers in Europe. When deployed in the Pacific, these guns easily destroyed Japanese armor from over a kilometer away. To Japanese crews trained on 57mm or 40-70mm cannons, this was devastating. They could not even get within firing range before being obliterated. Even the older M10 Wolverine, with its 3-inch gun and angular hull, was superior to anything Japan could field. Its silhouette, low and deceptive, made it nearly invisible in shadowed terrain. But the brilliance of these machines wasn't just firepower, it was engineering simplicity. American factories could build hundreds of them each month, repair them easily in the field, and keep them running with interchangeable parts. Japan could not. Their tanks were handmade, built in small batches, often with poor quality steel. Every loss was irreplaceable. Every American victory widened that gap. For every Japanese tank destroyed, 3 more American machines were already being shipped across the Pacific. To the Japanese soldier crouched in the mud, that wasn't just technological defeat. It was psychological collapse. They realized they were fighting an enemy that could outproduce, outdesign, and outthink them at every level. In the Pacific jungles, technology, tactics, and human endurance fused into one relentless rhythm. The sound of tracks grinding through mud, the flash of 76mm shells cutting through mist. And for the Japanese forces who believed courage could bridge every gap, that rhythm was the sound of an empire's illusions burning away. For the Japanese tank crews, the battlefield in 1944 was a waking nightmare. They had trained for years believing their machines were fast, reliable, and righteous tools of the emperor's will. In China and Southeast Asia, they had triumphed easily against opponents who had little armor to fight back. That early success became an illusion they would pay for in blood. At Leyte, Luzon, and Okinawa, that illusion shattered. Japanese gunners watched in disbelief as American destroyers appeared where tanks shouldn't be. On hillsides, riverbanks, even through jungle paths thought impassable. They fired first, but nothing happened. Their 47mm shells glanced off sloped hulls like pebbles on glass. The next moment, a blinding flash erased their entire crew. Reports recovered after the war tell of stunned survivors who could not comprehend what they had faced. Some described the M18's movement as unnatural, as if the machine was gliding on air. Others wrote that the Americans fired before we could even adjust the sight. Tank commanders wept as their formations were reduced to wrecks in minutes. For a culture that worshipped courage, that humiliation cut deep. The Imperial Army had been taught that spirit could overcome technology. Now they faced a weapon that defied that creed. No matter how brave the crew, no amount of shouting, charging, or sacrifice could change the outcome. The destroyers didn't fight men. They erased them. And for Japan's tank corps, that realization was more painful than defeat itself. Behind every innovation stands a philosophy, and behind every failure, a refusal to change. On the American side, General Leslie J. McNair's vision had matured through brutal trial. In North Africa, tank destroyers had proven their concept against German armor. In Europe, they evolved further, learning the balance between mobility and survivability. By the time they reached the Pacific, their doctrine was no longer theory. It was muscle memory. Commanders knew when to ambush, when to move, and how to integrate infantry and artillery with mechanized power. Each battlefield became an orchestra of movement, every note timed to perfection. Japan, by contrast, suffered from isolation and pride. Its armored doctrine had been frozen since the 1930s, when Japan fought enemies with little armor of their own. When evidence of inferiority emerged, the leadership dismissed it. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, warned Tokyo that Japan's armor and artillery were hopelessly outdated. His reports went ignored. Production quotas remained small. Emphasis stayed on morale, not modernization. By the time Japan realized the scale of the American industrial machine, it was too late. While U.S. commanders studied every engagement, revising doctrine daily, Japan's senior officers clung to dogma. The result was tragic. Brave men sent into unwinnable battles, fighting enemies they could neither see nor comprehend. Leadership, not courage, had doomed them. War is not just a contest of weapons, it's a test of what humans believe about power. For the Americans, tank destroyers symbolized control. They embodied a kind of rational precision, a machine built not for glory, but for efficiency. Every engagement was calculated, every movement rehearsed. For the Japanese, the tank was a vessel of honor. Crews saw their machines as extensions of the samurai spirit, courage forged in steel. They entered battle with the conviction that willpower could alter reality. But when courage met calculation, calculation won. In the aftermath of each engagement, the fields were filled not just with wreckage, but with silence, a silence that spoke of a deeper truth. War had entered a new age, an age where belief and bravery meant less than logistics, science, and production. One Japanese survivor later wrote, "We had spirit. They had factories, and yet, amid the destruction, there was no triumph." For the American crews who watched the burning hulks through binoculars, victory felt hollow. They respected the enemy's resolve even as they destroyed it. Many described an eerie pity, seeing men charge hopelessly at armor with grenades in hand, as if defying death could undo reality. It could not. The Pacific Campaign became a grim teacher. Technology does not conquer humanity. It consumes it. Each victory carried the weight of moral fatigue. Each destroyed tank was a reminder that progress often means leaving something sacred behind. By 1945, both sides had changed forever. Japan had learned that valor cannot replace velocity. America had learned that mastery of machines demands a cost, the fading of the human face behind the steel. And soon, that understanding would lead both nations into their most defining battles, where tank destroyers would meet. Japan's last desperate defenses, in fire and mud. The morning began with fog and rain, a gray curtain hanging over the rice paddies and palm groves. For the Japanese 1st Tank Division, this was supposed to be their moment of redemption. They had waited years for a real armored battle, a chance to prove that their steel could still shape the war. But the battlefield that awaited them belonged to another world. American forces had landed on Leyte 5 days earlier. The beaches were secured, the supply lines open, and with them came the 637th and 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalions, equipped with M10 Wolverines and the newly arrived M18 Hellcats. They were not ordinary tankers. They were hunters. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Shiro Makino, believed he could strike a decisive blow by counterattacking through the Pala Valley, cutting off the American advance toward the interior. At dawn, over 30 Japanese tanks, mostly Type 97 Chiha and a few Type 95 Heigo, moved into position, their engines rumbling softly under the canopy of trees. They advanced through mist and mud, their tracks sinking into the soaked earth. Infantry followed, cheering, waving banners with the rising sun. For a moment, there was hope, the illusion that the old fire still burned. Then came the first flash. From half a mile away, hidden along a ridge, an American Hellcat fired. The shell struck the lead Chiha square in the front plate. The explosion was instantaneous, turret lifted clean off, smoke billowing skyward. The column halted in confusion. The second shot came before the echo of the first had faded. Another Japanese tank vanished in fire. American tank destroyers had set the perfect trap. Camouflaged behind bamboo and coconut trees, their commanders watched through binoculars as the enemy stumbled forward. The doctrine that had been rehearsed for years in Louisiana and North Africa was now executed flawlessly in the Pacific. Seek, strike, destroy. The M18s shifted position, engines roaring, firing, moving again before counterfire could reach them. Their high-velocity shells tore through Japanese armor like paper. Some destroyers fired from over 1,200 yards, double the range of the Japanese guns. Within minutes, the entire formation fell apart. Japanese crews tried to flank, but the destroyers were faster. They hit and vanished, appearing from new angles like phantoms. The radio chatter among Japanese units dissolved into panic. American infantry, watching from nearby ridges, described the scene as surreal. Tanks bursting into flames one after another, the air filled with black smoke and shrapnel. A few Japanese tanks managed to return fire, their shells bouncing harmlessly off the Hellcat's sloped hulls or missing entirely as the Americans darted from cover to cover. By noon, the battlefield was a graveyard of steel. Of the 30 tanks that began the attack, fewer than 5 remained operational. Most of the survivors tried to retreat, but even that was impossible. The destroyers pursued them relentlessly, firing until the last one burned. The smell of fuel and death hung over the valley. American crews emerged from their turrets, drenched in sweat and oil, their ears ringing from hours of combat. They had executed the doctrine perfectly. No losses, no hesitation. For the Japanese survivors, the defeat was incomprehensible. They had fought with honor, charged bravely, and died believing their courage could make a difference. But against a machine that could see farther, move faster, and strike harder, bravery had no meaning. Reports from captured Japanese officers later revealed their astonishment. They had expected heavy, cumbersome American armor, not agile predators. One officer wrote, "Their guns struck before we even saw them. They fought like shadows, appearing, firing, disappearing again." What the Japanese witnessed on Leyte was more than a tactical defeat. It was a revelation. The world had entered a new phase of warfare, one in which precision, mobility, and design outweighed valor. As night fell, the valley still burned. The silhouettes of destroyed tanks glowed red against the rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a Hellcat engine hummed, idling, waiting, ready to move again. For the Americans, Leyte was proof that their experiment had succeeded. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of the end of their armored dream. But the storm was not over. Beyond Leyte lay Okinawa, the last great defense of the empire, where Japan would throw everything it had left into one final inferno. By the time the Americans landed, Japan's empire was already bleeding from every front. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima was gone. Tokyo burned nightly under American bombers. But on Okinawa, 60 miles long, riddled with caves and cliffs, the Imperial Army prepared to make its final stand. The Japanese knew they could not stop the invasion, so they sought to make it so costly, so horrific, that America would hesitate before invading the home islands. For that, they gathered everything that could still move, including their last tanks. The 27th Tank Regiment, along with remnants of the 4th and 19th Regiments, assembled near Shuri and Kakazu Ridge. Their total strength barely exceeded 50 operational vehicles, a mix of Type 97 Chiha, Type 95 Heigo, and a few Type 1 Chai-He medium tanks. Against them stood more than 1,000 American armored vehicles, supported by artillery, airstrikes, and naval gunfire. But the true threat didn't come from the skies or the sea. It came from the ground, from fast, ruthless American tank destroyer battalions that had perfected their craft in every previous battle. The 706th 3rd and 706th Battalions were among those deployed on Okinawa, armed now with the M18 Hellcat and M36 Jackson, both faster and deadlier than anything Japan had ever faced. When the invasion began on April 1, 1945, the beaches fell quickly. But once American armor pushed inland, it met the same silent defenders that had stopped entire armies in China and the Philippines. Hidden guns, camouflaged bunkers, and sudden counterattacks. That's where the tank destroyers came in. At Kakazu Ridge, Japanese tanks launched one of their few coordinated assaults of the battle. At dusk, 15 Chiha tanks and a company of infantry crept out from the caves under cover of darkness. They advanced across open ground toward the American positions, engines roaring, headlights off, hoping to close the distance before being detected. They didn't get far. The Hellcats were already waiting, dug in behind rock terraces and supported by spotters with infrared lamps and radios. The first M18 fired at 400 yards. The tracer arced through the dusk like a comet, striking the lead Chiha in the side. The tank erupted, illuminating the field and exposing the entire Japanese formation. Then the night came alive. From every ridge and gully, the Americans opened fire. The Hellcats fired and reversed, shifting to secondary positions while artillery rained down from above. Every time the Japanese tried to flank, another shell tore through their armor. In less than 20 minutes, 12 of the 15 Japanese tanks were destroyed. The remaining 3 tried to retreat, but U.S. infantry bazookas and air support finished the job. When dawn came, the ground around Kakazu Ridge was littered with twisted steel and blackened earth. The Japanese commanders were stunned. Their tanks had never even reached the American lines. One captured soldier told interrogators later, "We thought the enemy had dozens of guns. It was only a few, but they struck everywhere." For the American tank destroyer crews, Okinawa was the validation of everything they had trained for. Their machines were faster, their guns more lethal, and their crews more experienced than ever. They used terrain like a weapon, striking from behind stone walls, temple ruins, and coral ridges. But victory came at a price. Okinawa was not just a tank battle, it was hell on earth. Rain turned the island into a sea of mud. Corpses lay bloated in craters. The air reeked of decay. Even the tank destroyers struggled in the endless downpour, their engines clogging with mud, their treads slipping on coral slopes. Still, they advanced. Every cave, every hill, every bunker, cleared, crushed, and burned. By June, the Japanese 27th Tank Regiment no longer existed. Not a single operational tank survived. Their final assault, on June 4th, ended with 4 Chiha tanks destroyed before firing a shot. The last tank battle of Japan had ended, not with a heroic charge, but with silence. The wrecks were left to rust under the rain, half buried in the mud, symbols of a vanished era. The Americans didn't celebrate. For them, Okinawa was victory wrapped in tragedy. 12,000 dead, 36,000 wounded. But for Japan, it was the death of hope. Their tank divisions, once symbols of modern strength, were gone. The Empire's dream of mechanized warfare had been shattered completely. And as the surviving American tank destroyers rolled back toward the beaches, their crews didn't know that this was the last battle they'd ever fight. 2 months later, the war would end, not with armor or fire, but with a flash over Hiroshima. The tank destroyers had done their job. They had hunted the hunters, and in doing so, they had shown the world what modern warfare had become: fast, precise, and merciless. When Okinawa finally fell on June 22, 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final act. What remained of Japan's once proud army was scattered, broken, and hollow. Entire divisions had been erased from the map, not just by superior firepower, but by an evolution of warfare that Japan could no longer keep up with. The Japanese tank force, already weakened by years of attrition, was functionally extinct. Across the Philippines, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, hundreds of Chiha and Hago tanks lay rusting in tropical mud. Some were half buried in coral, or still pointing their guns toward the sea. Monuments of a vanished doctrine. Japan's armored corps, which had once rolled confidently through China and Manchuria, had been annihilated in the Pacific Islands without ever fighting on equal terms. For the Americans, this victory confirmed something profound. Their tank destroyer command, created in 1941 amid fierce debate, had finally proven its worth. At the start of the war, critics within the U.S. Army had questioned whether these lightly armored, fast-moving gun platforms were necessary. But the Pacific battles, and especially Leyte and Okinawa, silenced the argument. The M10 Wolverine, M18 Hellcat, and M36 Jackson had achieved what they were designed to do: to counter enemy armor quickly, from a distance and with overwhelming precision. They didn't rely on brute force or armor thickness. They relied on agility, visibility, and accuracy. That doctrine, mobility over mass, was now vindicated. After-action reports from the 706th and 763rd. Battalions described engagements where American destroyers consistently outshot Japanese tanks at ranges over 1,000 yards. One commander wrote, "The enemy tanks were obsolete before they reached the battlefield." Even so, the respect for the enemy remained. U.S. crews often remarked on the bravery of Japanese tankmen, soldiers who charged despite knowing their weapons could not penetrate American armor. But beneath the statistics and tactical lessons, something deeper emerged. Okinawa had revealed the emotional cost of total victory. American soldiers walked through fields littered with burnt tanks, twisted bodies, and shattered helmets. The rain never stopped, and neither did the memory of what they'd done. Many crews later recalled that they stopped cheering after each kill. There was nothing left to celebrate. For Japan, the aftermath was even more haunting. Military engineers and surviving officers submitted post-battle analyses to Tokyo, admitting that their armor design was now hopelessly outdated. They had already been developing heavier models, the Type 4 Chito and Type 5 Chi-Rai, with thicker armor and high-velocity guns, but production had barely begun. American bombing raids on Honshu had destroyed the factories before a single unit could reach the front. The lesson was bitter but clear. Courage could not replace engineering. Speed, precision, and communication now defined modern warfare, qualities that Japan's resource-starved army could no longer sustain. Meanwhile, in Washington and Fort Knox, the U.S. Army began drawing its own conclusions. Tank destroyers had been invaluable in the Pacific, but strategists knew that future wars would look different. The success of the Hellcat and Jackson had come not from their concept alone, but from the circumstances, against outdated tanks, in environments where mobility ruled. In Europe, the same doctrine had struggled against German armor. By July 1945, the U.S. Army began quietly phasing out the separate tank-destroyer command. The lessons of the Pacific would be absorbed into a new generation of combined arms tactics, where tanks, infantry, and artillery fought as one. Still, for the men who had served in those sleek, open-topped machines, the pride remained. They had fought in some of the harshest terrain on Earth, jungles, mountains, and volcanic ash, and had never failed their mission. They were the hunters of the Pacific, and though the war was almost over, the shadow of what they'd seen, the burned forests, the blackened tanks, the silent valleys, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The war had changed them. It had changed everyone, but the story of the tank destroyers and their decisive role in crushing Japan's last armored hope was not yet complete. What followed, in the final weeks of the war, would seal their place in history forever. Japan's cities were in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had vanished in light and ash. The empire's once proud army, 6 million men, was fragmented, isolated, and starving. And its armored divisions, once a symbol of modernization and strength, had been wiped out completely across the home islands. Hundreds of unfinished tanks sat abandoned in factory yards and rail depots. Half-built hulls, stripped engines, unmounted turrets. Some belonged to the new Chito and Chi-Ri series, designs that, had they arrived 2 years earlier, might have changed Japan's fortunes. But now, they were relics of a lost race. Machines conceived too late for a nation already defeated by industry and time. When Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, American officers began touring the ruins of its military infrastructure. At Sagami Arsenal, at Tomakomai, and in the forests near Nagano, they found rusting prototypes, incomplete blueprints, and scattered armor crews who had never seen combat. The U.S. reports described Japan's tank program as brave but obsolete. Its weakness, they wrote, lay not in courage, but in isolation. While the U.S. and Germany had learned from armored warfare in real time, adapting, evolving, rearming, Japan's industry had stood still, cut off by geography and blockade. Its tanks remained products of the 1930s, designed for colonial campaigns, not modern mechanized war. The Pacific had exposed that truth brutally. In the immediate aftermath, U.S. military analysts compiled detailed assessments of the tank destroyer battalion's performance. Their conclusion was clear. In the Pacific, these units had been decisive. They had neutralized Japan's limited armor, supported infantry assaults, and destroyed countless fortified positions with speed and accuracy. One report from the U.S. Sixth Army summarized it simply. The tank destroyer proved not just an anti-tank weapon, but a flexible assault gun, the spearhead of American firepower. Yet, paradoxically, their success also marked their end. Because tank destroyers had fulfilled their purpose so completely, the Army saw no further need for them. By 1946, the Independent Tank Destroyer Command was dissolved, its veterans were reassigned to armored divisions, and its doctrines folded into broader combined arms strategies. Still, the spirit of the Hellcat and Jackson lived on. Their lessons about mobility, flexibility, and precision would influence every tank built in the early Cold War. From the American M26 Pershing to the M48 Patton and even the Soviet T-54, engineers now sought balance, speed with armor, firepower with agility. The era of specialization was over. The era of the all-purpose main battle tank had begun. In Japan, the end of the war brought silence. The once glorious Imperial Army was disbanded. Factories were dismantled. Engineers who had once built tanks turned to civilian machines, tractors, buses, and construction vehicles. When Japan eventually rebuilt its self-defense forces decades later, its armored doctrine would draw not from its wartime past, but from the American system that had defeated it. For the men who had fought on both sides, the memory lingered. American Hellcat crews remembered the smell of burnt steel and jungle smoke. Japanese tankmen remembered the blinding flashes that turned courage into cinders. The Pacific had taught both armies the same hard lesson. In modern war, speed and vision outweighed valor. When the war ended, the surviving tank destroyers were shipped home or scrapped. Some were sold to allied nations. Others rusted away in depots from Luzon to Okinawa. A few remain today, silent exhibits in museums, their paint faded, their barrels cold, reminders of an age when steel met steel under the tropic sun. But their legacy endures in every fast, high-velocity tank gun that came after. The Hellcat's doctrine, seek, strike, destroy, became the unspoken creed of modern armor. It was the culmination of a philosophy that defined the American way of war. Fight smarter, move faster, hit first, and never give the enemy a second chance. And so, by the war's end, the tank destroyer had achieved something no weapon ever had before. It had rendered its own existence unnecessary. Because once it proved how devastating speed and precision could be, every army on Earth sought to build tanks that no longer needed to be destroyed at all. The war had ended, but the idea it birthed, the balance between agility and power, would define every battlefield for the next 50 years. In war, innovation is born from fear and perfected through necessity. The American tank destroyers were never meant to be icons. They were tools, created in urgency, refined in combat, and retired the moment their work was done. Yet in their brief existence, they embodied a transformation that defined the 20th century. The shift from bravery to efficiency, from heroism to design. For the Japanese, the war had shown the cost of standing still. Their tank divisions had once symbolized ambition and modernity, but time had turned those symbols into relics. When the M18 Hellcat raced across Leyte or Okinawa, it wasn't just defeating steel, it was defeating an idea that courage alone could defy technology. Every battlefield told the same truth. Speed was survival. Precision was power. Information, knowing where to strike, when to move, how to adapt, had become more valuable than numbers or armor. That lesson would carry humanity into the next century, shaping everything from the Cold War's tank armies to the digital weapons of today. But beneath the strategies and blueprints lay something timeless, the human spirit that drove both sides. Japanese crews who climbed into tanks, knowing they would never return. American destroyer men who faced heat, mud, and death in open-topped machines, trusting only their training and each other. They were not so different. Each fought for his world, his homeland, his belief in duty, and each became part of a story larger than himself. Today, the rusted hulks of Chiha tanks and the restored Hellcats that sit in museums are silent, but not forgotten. They remind us that progress always comes with a price, that every leap forward in technology carries a shadow behind it. Because every weapon that changes war also changes the people who build it, use it, and survive it. In the Pacific, the tank destroyers did what they were made to do. They hunted, they struck, they destroyed. But in doing so, they also ended an era and began another. Steel may win battles, but understanding, the will to learn, to adapt, to evolve, is what wins history.